Okay, now we're turning our attention from digital resilience to physical resilience, specifically how extreme environments shape HVAC design. Canada's northern territories face some of the harshest conditions on Earth: extreme cold and wind, limited infrastructure, and remote communities. Designing for these environments requires a completely different approach where climate, geography, logistics, and culture play a critical role. Here to walk us through the realities and innovation behind extreme HVAC design is Nis Feiner from Delta T Designs. Please join me in welcoming Nis to the stage.
Thank you very much.
Take away.
And thank you for pronouncing my last name properly, Paul. Most people don't get that, which is a really nice thing. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to meet you all today, and I'm thrilled to speak to you today about, as Paul said, HVAC in extreme environments, and more specifically in Arctic environments and in remote communities, which present some fantastic challenges that, while we're all very familiar with HVAC and potentially HVAC design, there's a very different context that really means we have to look at things quite differently. So my presentation does include downloadable links. I've got QR codes throughout. Now, rather than distract you with your phones and have you rather pay attention to the presentation, I do have a QR code right at the beginning, and this will allow you to download the PDF. If for whatever reason it's an issue and you can't get it to work, which sometimes happens with a blurry QR code, then I've made these available and ORAC can release these on request. I do have some supplemental information with the QR codes, as well as videos I shot when I was up north for my students that provide a very interesting perspective on what we're discussing. So today, I'm going to go over here so the QR code's more visible, and this is visible. But today I want to review a few things here. We want to talk about the climate and geography, and climate is the most obvious way that the North is different, but the more interesting way that it's different is the geography as well as the infrastructure. So we are going to be discussing that today. And we're also, as Paul said, looking at the culture and the communities, which are very, very different from our own, and that's to be expected. But what's really interesting is how it influences building design and the construction environment. Okay? So we're going to discuss all of these today. Now, I've got a lovely photo here. This is a drone shot I took of the Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway, coming back from Tuktoyaktuk. It's a 150-kilometer highway through the tundra, amazing scenery, and it really lets you know how far away you are from most of the Canadian populace. And you really get this good sense of being alone and how difficult it can be to work in such an environment. Now, buildings designed for use in northern, remote, and Arctic environments face unique challenges that are not found in more southern urban centers. So special considerations really need to be given to these circumstances to ensure that first and foremost, our buildings are safe and healthy for the occupants. Secondary to that is that our building is sustainable over the lifespan that is expected of it. So a little bit of who I am. My name is Nis. I'm a certified engineering technologist with my design firm, Delta T Designs, and I do focus and specialize in Arctic and remote community design. I've been in the industry actually just coming up 20 years. I've been on the contracting end for 14 of those years. And I'm also an instructor for HRAI, teaching building design across Canada, as well as a prof at George Brown College here in Toronto, which is where I just came from. I got into this space, this northern space, fairly recently. I was never actually supposed to be in engineering. I was supposed to be a pilot. And part of that would have meant going up north and doing the bush pilot thing, which I was on track to do. Where that track got a bit derailed was when I joined my family's mechanical contracting company to save up money for my plane, train, and then move north. And then I found an opportunity. My dad actually said, hey, we need somebody to do some design sometime. Would you like to take some of these courses? Specifically, my career started in the HRAI small commercial heat loss course. And then I found something I was kind of good at, interested in, and I saw the potential. So I decided to stay. But that call north never really left me. And it got to a point in my career where I said, you know what? I've got skills that are in demand. I'm really interested in doing this. Let's see what it'll take to make a go of it. And so I went through my network. I was at dinner with a colleague from ASHRAE, who's part of the region that has Alaska. And I asked if she knew any engineers who'd be willing to talk to me. And she connected me with somebody who's a good friend of mine in Anchorage now. And he told me, you need to go to University of Alaska and you need to take that Northern Building Design course. You need to come to the conferences that we're having. Because a big issue that faces communities in the north is that we get Southern engineers to do the design work and they get it all wrong. Because they do not appreciate just how different this is. And I knew I didn't want to be that. I knew that if I was going to go make a go of this, there would be learning curves. I would get some things wrong, but other people will end up paying the consequence in some very, very harsh realities. So I had to do the best I possibly could to learn it before I applied it. And so that's what I did. I did take these courses, which I'm going to talk about at the end of the presentation and give you some links. And it really comes with understanding why this is different and why we need to put in this effort and think differently about this environment. So the first thing we'll talk about is the climate and geography. Now, the north is cold. We all understand that. In fact, looking here, we're looking at ASHRAE climate zone, climate zone 8 up here. Now what happens is the Earth is tilted on an angle. The axial tilt of the Earth means that the further north you go, the less sunshine you see. And as a result, this means we have less solar heating throughout the year and we have our colder temperatures. Now what we'll see is above a certain latitude, about 66 degrees north, which is the Arctic Circle, we start getting periods of 24 hours of darkness or 24 hours of sunlight. And as we go into the winter, communities like Inuvik, Paulatuk, further north, Grise Fjord and whatnot, they are starting to experience this 24-hour period of darkness. And so this is how we can account for the drastically different climate. It's just seeing much less sun. And so yes, it does get very cold. And in fact, if we look at our outdoor design temperature here for Inuvik Airport in the Northwest Territories, we can see we're dealing with a design temperature. Let's use, freedom units here. Where's my SI? I think it doesn't actually really matter because they're so close. Either way, it's pretty much minus 40 degrees. Minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius. Because of how critical these environments are and how there isn't a lot of backups, we have to take the worst case scenario. So we're not looking at just the 99%, but we're actually looking at the 99.6%. If we can take care of those days, we can take care of the easier days. So it is very cold. Contrast that with Toronto, where I've just recently done some designs down here, and we're looking at a 0 degree Fahrenheit outdoor design temperature. So pretty significant difference. But how does that impact our design? Well, we do have a very large temperature difference between the inside and the outside, and most obviously that manifests it with conductive heat loss, right? We are losing heat through those walls much quicker, and that makes sense. But there's other aspects that we don't consider that are really unique to these environments. One, we don't have the benefit of high efficiency equipment for the most part. We're dealing with mid-efficiency oil boilers because they're very reliable and they're very resilient. But another reason is we want to be cautious about sending up fully saturated flue gas. Because as we see in some instances or some photos, if you have a very, very cold surface nearby, like a roof or even the flue, it's going to start icing up inside and start closing that. So we are constrained by less ideal equipment, in a huge part by the logistics and infrastructure issues, which I'll discuss, but in no small part just because of the temperatures we're dealing with here. The other thing is, and this goes back to the logistics, but also plays into the temp climate, is our energy in the north is not delivered by pipeline or by wire like it is down south. It is delivered by truck and by ship, okay? We are doing bulk fuel transfers where we are loading up by sea lift these massive tanks and filling up bulk oil tanks in the communities. And what that means is we also have a finite supply of fuel in the community. Down here, if we're wasteful, if we have the furnace run nonstop, that's an economic problem. You can keep getting as much gas as the company will let you before they cut you off for down payment. In these communities, you run out of fuel, you've run out of fuel. That's it. Your replacement will come in one of two ways. Sea lift next year at ice out when we can get the ships out of Quebec, or you could fly it in. And to give you some context for some of these communities, just to get you or I in, let alone our gear, just us in a King Air to a community like Grise Fjord, you're $7,000 to $10,000 a ticket to get to these communities. Because there are no regularly scheduled airlines, and if they are, they're very, very small aircraft. And there aren't that many people to spread the cost around. So you're starting to get a sense here, even with this little introduction, about some of the challenges we face and how they manifest themselves. The other thing is we're not dealing with natural gas. We're dealing with number 1 heating oil, number 2 heating oil, diesel, maybe propane. We see a lot of propane in places like Yellowknife and Inuvik, Whitehorse, where we do have the road connection. Once we're off-road, that disappears and it all becomes oil. The other thing that's really interesting is how we get our other utilities. You can go to the sink here, open it up, and all the water you'll ever need will come out. Not so in a lot of these communities. We have very, very small populations and spread out, and that becomes an economic mess to try to get piped water to every house and pipe sanitary out. So what we have instead are sewage holding tanks outside the house, or the building, whatever it may be, and domestic water tanks inside that get filled up roughly every 3 days. And with the water not freezing, it'll be 0 degrees Celsius when it comes in. So consider that. You have to, or you don't have to, but the reality is you do warm up this water as a parasitic load. But now you're getting 1,500 liters of water, 0 degree water, delivered into your house every 3 days. That is a penalty, a tax that they have to pay just for existing in these communities that the rest of us do not have to contend with. So again, we start layering a bit of the complexity here. And as I mentioned, we've got the sanitary tank outside. Now, a whole lot of time and effort gets put in here to making sure that when you flush that toilet, the poop goes somewhere where you don't care about. A whole lot of time and energy is spent in these communities making sure that the poop literally does not freeze so the honey truck can come and pump this tank out. So consider that. Consider the last time you looked at your hydro bill and your gas bill. Have you ever thought how much money you're spending just to keep your poo warm? These communities are. So again, this is a very, very different environment. And we look at communities in the north and we may take a very dim view. We talk about how expensive it is in a lot of places that don't have clean water. And we ask ourselves, why is this? It should be such a simple solution. But as I'll show you, it's really anything but. It's a very complex way we have to think about things to get these projects completed. And as obvious as the cold is, that's actually the least, I think, interesting from an engineering standpoint, the least interesting complication. Everything else is higher on my priority of problems to solve. Now, as an example, for the energy that we use as it relates to the cold climate, let's look at an HRV. Now, you now are all doubt quite familiar with HRVs, right? We exhaust that warm air, we bring in the colder air, and we transfer some of that heat. And it's really efficient because we're recovering some of that heat. But here we have the luxury of allowing that HRV go into defrost mode, which will happen as that moisture starts freezing up. We can't afford that to happen in these buildings. We are dealing in the territory of Nunavut with a population density versus housing opportunity that is critical. We are seeing something like, I think the last statistic I saw was 2.8 people per bedroom in Nunavut. A lot of these 3-bedroom houses have 12 people in them. And you can imagine that's a lot of moisture we're generating, that's a lot of odor, that's a lot of effluent. We need to ventilate these buildings. On top of that, it's so cold outside that any moisture that will make its way through the envelope is going to condense and start damaging the building and creating mold issues. So this is actually a serious health and safety concern, and we have to ventilate. So what that means is we put in a preheater. We are warming this air up before it even gets to our HRV core, so we can maintain a core temperature of at least 0 degrees Celsius, because we cannot stop ventilating. We have to keep doing it. And so yet again, we have an expense that most people here may not even think about in these communities, because preheating the air is pretty antithetical to what the HRV is about, right? The HRV is there to preheat it for us. But physics overrules that. And the consequences are so high, we can't abide by that. So we have to prevent it from freezing. The other thing here we mentioned was that saturated flue gas. We're seeing it here. This is going to be probably an oil-fired boiler or a wood stove, and then here we have a two-pipe system. But you can see as soon as you hit that cold termination, those flue gases start icing up. And it doesn't take too long before that can close off entirely, and we no longer have effective venting of our appliance. And then we fail the blower check. Actually, there's no blower in that, but we end up going out on safety, and we don't have heat. And you can imagine at minus 40 or minus 45 degrees, that's not an inconvenience. That is a critical emergency. And not only that, we're not just going to let these people freeze to death in the community, right? Obviously, we're going to take them into somewhere else. But now you've taken an already critical overcrowding issue in one house and doubled it. So the consequences are very high. We really have to think through these things and evaluate what could go wrong. We must always design from a position of failure. What happens when the worst happens? And this is actually something that is critical up north, but I argue it's good practice down here. Obviously, the stakes aren't as high, but things will fail. So what happens when they do? We should have a plan for that, and we should think about it. The other thing I find interesting is our terminations, right? We send this air outside of the house from the HRV or the building or what have you, and typically we'll do this with some sort of weather hood, or we'll do it with a louver. But the problem is louvers will clog with snow, so we have to protect that somehow. So we would build maybe a weather hood. And the problem with that is they'll ice up, or they'll get covered in snow, and the forces at play are really, really interesting. Because when you're on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and there's absolutely nothing to break that wind, and you start loading this up with ice and snow, we start breaking things. We start ripping hoods off the side of buildings. And so you had what was developed, it used to be called an Arctic T, which would be a hood that was an inverted T open on both sides. And the idea was that if it started filling with snow, well, you could stick a broom through it and clear it out. We've moved away from that to this sort of Arctic hood. And a few things are critical about this and really show good thought about the environment we're working in. One, you'll see that our hood is actually cut off at a 45-degree angle. The reason for this is we're opening or increasing the surface area of that opening. So if we do get any sort of ice or snow clogging it, hopefully we don't clog the whole thing and obstruct it completely. The other thing is we have a minimum of 6 inches from the wall. And that's so any snow or ice can get around it rather than clog up that space and start building more snow. And the other thing is we have some pretty skookum angle there holding this whole thing up. Because when we get those really, really strong winds off of the ocean, we're going to apply a lot of torque to the side of that unit. And again, we risk ripping it off. So this is something that we have to adapt our conventional process or conventional design to suit the environment. And again, I mean, you guys are contractors. Would any of you consider putting something like this down in Forest Hill or maybe in Vaughan? It's just not necessary and the cost isn't justified. But I can assure you it's a lot cheaper to do this than it is there to go up and replace it when it rips off the wall. So these are the considerations we have to factor in. As I mentioned, we do have, in a lot of communities, most communities, we have our tanked water and our tanked sewer. And this is actually something, being in this space, I often lament the resources we provide for these communities as being insufficient. But the truth is, as Spartan as this is actually substantially better than what they have in Alaska in a lot of cases. The Canadian government came in and said, at the very least, everybody will have access to clean, potable water, and we will get rid of the waste for them. In Alaska, it's still quite common to go collect your own water in these small communities, as well as use the honey bucket. Anyone have an idea what the honey bucket might be? It's a bucket you poop in a bag, and then you close the bag, and then you take it to the lagoon for disposal. So we've said in Canada, not acceptable. That is not conducive to good health care. We will at the very least provide clean water and remove the waste for them. But it does mean we have to store it on site and we have to treat it on site, which is an additional cost and complexity that must be accounted for. The other thing is we have to find space for this. I just did some houses that were built in Ottawa, modular houses that were built in Ottawa, shipped to Montreal, and brought up by sea lift. And we had a hell of a time finding actual real estate in the building for these tanks. Because it's not just these tanks, it's your boiler, which is a big cast iron boiler. It's your indirect water heater. It's the combustion air coming in. It's your washer and your dryer, and everything adds and adds and adds. And so this is a whole challenge unto itself. The other thing is we have very clear guidelines on the orientation for our potable water fill and for our honey wagon connection. Because what we can't have is when they disconnect the sewage tank and drag that hose across the front area that's still leaking, what you don't then want is the water guy to come in with his clean potable water hose, drag it across all the crap on the front lawn and then connect it. So we even have to think about how these things are going to be accessed and serviced, which is a challenge unto itself. And as I said, we have our sewage tanks here, and this is a sewage connection in Yellowknife. So in Yellowknife, there's actually, who here remembers, was it the Tom Cochrane or Bryan Adams album, Ragged Ass Road? Anybody remember that? No? I'll stop using that reference, it never seems to work. Anyway, there's a street in Yellowknife called Ragged Ass Road, and that's where that album comes from. And in Ragged Ass Road, it's part of Old Town. So it was built before Yellowknife became a real city. And so they still have sewage tanks and water tanks in urban Yellowknife. And as part of the city services, they send the honey truck around and the water truck as well. Okay? Now, the climate also affects our soil. And we're dealing with areas that have permafrost. And what permafrost is defined as soil that is frozen for 2 years and the intervening summers. And because it's so cold, we start freezing the ground, and it never really stops freezing until you get really, really deep. So what we're seeing here is our conventional trumpet graph. And this is our temperature profile in the soil with the permafrost. So what you can see here in the first 2.5 meters, this is referred to as the active layer. Throughout the year, this will thaw and this will refreeze. But once we get below the active layer, and you can see this is the temperature profile. So within the 2 meters, it'll get colder than 0 degrees and it'll get warmer than 0 degrees. But once we get to about 2.5 meters, we are fairly consistent at 0 degrees. We'll have warmer ice, we'll have colder ice, but we'll always have some sort of ice. And it's critical that we understand this. This isn't just academic, because at the end of the day, if you build a building, what you are doing, no matter what building it is you are transferring all those loads down to the ground. That's what all these columns are here for, is to carry all the load from the levels above us, transfer it to the ground. But that all presumes that the ground is stable and the ground is there when you need it. The problem with permafrost is you have so much moisture in that ice that once it thaws, that ground is no longer stable. A lot of your ground starts washing away, and the building goes with it. So protecting the permafrost is absolutely critical. And we can think of this as maybe somebody else's problem, and that's the civil engineer's problem or the structural engineer's problem. And perhaps, but when we're in the heat business, we have to think about where that heat goes. And so we have to think about how we protect the ground from the heat of our building, especially if we're considering things like in-floor heating, where now you're heating the floor of the building. How do we reduce the heat transfer from the floor to the soil? Now, permafrost is not continuous everywhere. This shows our permafrost locations within Canada, and you'll have what's called discontinuous permafrost. And so what that means is, depending on the local geology, the soil in the area, you'll get some permafrost in some areas and not in others. To get permafrost, we need the three same things we need to get frost in general. We're going to need cold temperatures, we're going to need water, and we're going to need frost-susceptible soil. And what that means is the soil is of a fine enough grain that through capillary action we start wicking that moisture up. And that's how we get the frost heave in the ground. And so if we don't have a soil that's conducive to that, we won't have it. And so what you can see here, over here, which is the Beaufort Delta, that's where the Mackenzie River drains into the Beaufort Sea. It's a delta, so you had fine sediment deposited there over millennia. That is a permafrost region. We've got that really fine soil that's conducive for it and a lot of water. But in the eastern Arctic, where we had the thickest part and the most recent glaciation, that's not soil, that's till. That's a lot of ground up rock. So it doesn't really hold the moisture, which means permafrost is less of a concern. But the point of bringing this up is you don't know where it will be until you look for it. So it always has to be a question. I'm designing a building in this community. Is permafrost a concern? Do I need to mitigate that? Now, as I said, the permafrost provides a structure for our building, but this is a bit of an abstract concept. So let's look at actual permafrost and look at it from beneath. I had the privilege of going through the US Army Corps of Engineers permafrost lab in Fairbanks, Alaska. And what this was a series of tunnels that were used to see how permafrost behaves, to study it and understand it. And that's what we're actually looking at here, is permafrost from beneath. And so what you can see is some very, very clear ice components here. And this is a very fine glacial sediment. So like I said, if we melted this, you would be in awe of how much soil would come out of this. It just does a great job of storing it all. And once it's gone, your ground is running away from you. And so we have to maintain it. So how do we do that? Well, first thing we do is we're going to raise our foundations. Get the house or the building off of the ground. This serves two purposes. One, it minimizes the surface area in contact with the ground. Less surface area, less heat conducted through. The other thing is it allows for wind in the winter to come under the building and refreeze that active layer. But human beings will do what human beings do, and they will try to ruin that for us. They will try to store things under there, like kayaks or snowmobiles or all of these other things, because we don't have a lot of storage space. And then that means we no longer get that wind going underneath and refreezing that active layer. So you'll often see fencing around that to keep animals of the more wild type and the more human type away from that crawl space, because we have to maintain it. The other thing you'll see here, this was taken in Inuvik. Inuvik is one of the few communities in Canada that has what's called a utilidor. I'll go into more about this later, but Inuvik actually does have a water main and a sewer main for the community. But because of the permafrost, it is all above grade in what we call the utilidor, which is this pipe here. So it's a corrugated metal pipe filled with insulation, and within it is our sanitary, our water, and our gas pipe, as well as hydronic heat tracing to keep it all warm. And again, we have to keep that above the ground because we can't risk that heat transferring to the ground and melting the permafrost. So we'll talk more about the economics of utilidors, but also very, very expensive. The reason Inuvik has a utilidor is because it's one of the few planned communities in the north. In the 1950s, there's a community of Aklavik in the Northwest Territories that was on the Mackenzie River that had to be relocated because of flooding from the Mackenzie. So they planned Inuvik to be the government hub town in the area. As a result, they were able to put in the infrastructure before they put in the buildings. But that's few and far between in our north in Canada. Most of our communities are a lot more, let's say, organic and came up without the ability to plan beforehand. If we can't raise the building and we can't stop the heat transfer to the permafrost, we have these things. These are called thermosiphons. And I love thermosiphons. Who here is a refrigeration mechanic, refrigeration apprentice by trade? Okay? So you guys will probably nerd out on this too. What this is a passive heat pump. So you have a tube embedded one end in the ground, above end we have convective fins, and we fill said tube with a refrigerant like CO2. And what happens is, in the winter, the ground is warmer than the air. So we boil off that CO2 in the ground, we carry that heat up, and then we reject that heat to the cold air in the winter, where the CO2 condenses and goes back down. There's no moving parts, there's no energy other than what we put in to monitor this. Very, very elegant solution where we see all the time. This out here was actually the Inuvik Hospital. They had to build it slab on grade. As you can imagine, a lot of sources for heat in a hospital to lose through the ground, so the permafrost had to be protected with a thermosiphon. We also see these along highways, bridges, and that sort of thing. Anything where it's staying above ground is very, very critical. We tend to see a thermosiphon. So those were like the climate conditions, but let's talk about the geographical consideration. The North is vast, it's huge, but there's very, very few people and they're spread out far between. So we don't have a lot of year-round roads. The shipping that we do in the North is done with year-round roads, the few that we have, and I'll talk about that, as well as summer ferries. Bridges can be expensive. For a long time, to cross the Mackenzie to Yellowknife, until I want to say 10, 15 years ago, it was all by ferry. They eventually built the bridge. So that's still a common thing. We also have winter or ice roads. We also have river barges and sea lift, as I mentioned, in air. But the thing is, all of these things are at the mercy of the climate. If the climate isn't conducive, just because we have infrastructure doesn't mean we get to use it. And I'll expand more on that in a bit when it comes to roads. But winter roads, ice roads, those are pretty obvious. If the water doesn't freeze enough, we can't drive on it. And that's a real problem. Even a real problem in Northern Ontario, where these communities rely so much on these ice roads. It is the difference between $5,000 to deliver a 20-foot sea can versus $30,000, $40,000 to deliver the same volume, actually probably even more, by air. So these ice roads are critical, but the problem is freeze up is happening later and thaw is happening sooner. So your window to use these ice roads is shrinking. With regards to the river barge, that was critical. All the goods that would get to the Beaufort Delta, so the communities of Tuktoyaktuk, Paulatuk, Ulahaktuk, all the communities along the Mackenzie, actually from Great Slave Lake all the way down, those all get their goods delivered by barge. And I don't know if you've been following, but we've been at, or the Northwest Territories has been at like a 15 to 16 year low water period. They have not been able to get their goods to those communities by barge. So we've built an entire economy, we've built entire communities and society around this level of infrastructure that is starting to fail us and starting to disappear. So we are putting in roads at a great expense. This road here, the red line, that's the Inuvik-Tuk Highway. That's the photo I showed you from the drone. It's 148 kilometers that connected Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk, and is now the one place in Canada you can drive year-round to touch the Arctic Ocean. Year-round isn't quite true. The reason that was red is because 3 weeks before I went there, that highway was closed. Full stop, closed. Why, you may ask? Because of snow, which sounds weird in the Arctic, but the Arctic is actually an arid or semi-arid region. They do not deal with a lot of falling precipitation. And they got dumped on. When we took the road, and I'll show you photos, we had graders out there moving snow piles taller than our truck. Tuktoyaktuk was cut off for 3 weeks. They started running out of food, they started running out of medicine, and their youth hockey league was trapped in Inuvik and had to fly home at great cost. They rely on that road. They didn't have it until something like 2014, and the whole community shifted as a result. Now what's interesting is also the cost. It's 140 kilometers, costs about, I want to say, 300 million, if memory serves, to build that last extension. Because of how complicated the construction is, all the things I'm telling you about are incredibly costly. So we have a challenge. The infrastructure we relied on for so long is starting to fail us. We have to start building new infrastructure. And the costs associated with that are staggering, and the timelines are very, very long. So we can talk about putting in roads now, and I just saw that the Fed's latest budget are looking at a $1 billion, I think, over 4-year investment, but that's not going to build that many roads, at least not to connect the communities the way we would hope. So these are challenges that must be factored in. Now, these green roads here, these are permanent year-round roads. Those exist. Everything else, those are ice roads. That is the entire territorial road network, other than small like municipal roads, of the Northwest Territories. You cannot drive from the territorial capital of Yellowknife, right here, to where I was in Tuktoyaktuk. You cannot drive there and stay within the Northwest Territories. You have to go south to Alberta, west to BC, north to the Yukon, and then back into Northwest Territories. It is just a logistical nightmare to move goods around. And as I said, here's another drone photo of my very lonely truck out on the Inuvik-Tuk Highway. Very remote, very serene. And we can see those graders that were out there. And so, as I said, it's really costly, and I'll show you some of the prices that they're experiencing in these communities as a result. Now, when I do, I want to say that truck that I rented, it was just like a Ford Ranger. I can't even remember what it was. When I filled it up, my rental after, I filled it up in Inuvik at $2.50 per liter, which, yeah, pretty expensive. And it got me thinking, I'll show you the prices in Tuk. And the prices in Tuk were also crazy high. And I was wondering, this is a community road access. I expect really high prices in the fly-in communities, but you can get here by truck. Why is everything so expensive? Then I looked at it further. You can drive from Toronto to Tuk if you want to. It is 300 kilometers more than if you drove to the center of the earth. That is how far we are talking. No matter how you cut it, that is a long way to go. That's a lot of people to drive truck. That's a lot of people to load and offload and store. The logistics involved are very high and very, very expensive, and all this compounds cost. Speaking of which, I did go to the northern store in Tuktoyaktuk, and the really cool thing about the northern store is they sell Kirkland products. So it becomes very easy to compare cost back home. What we see here is the northern store, this pack of toilet paper, 50 bucks. At home, 26. Maple syrup, liter, 27 bucks. 19 back home. Olive oil, same story. Iced tea, 8 bucks. I was the sucker that bought that bottle of iced tea. I really wanted it at the time. Plus, I took a sample of the Arctic Ocean with me, and that's what I keep it in. So money well spent, as I think. But the reason I'm showing this to you is because I want you to have a bit of empathy for the people on the other end. There is such a high cost with everything they have and very, very little economic opportunity. So they've got a lot of cost and not a lot of income. And at the end of the day, if you're building them a house or a building for their business, there's not a whole lot of money left over to pay the energy bill. And so we have to be empathetic and sympathetic to that fact and think about the energy, think about the logistics and everything that is involved. Now, speaking of energy, there's this map that I created that's on my website, and this shows, at least as of, I want to say 2017, every off-grid community in Canada. And when we say off-grid, it means they're not connected to the North American electrical grid. They are all on local microgrids producing their own electricity. We have 240 communities and just shy of 200,000 people. By no means is this the grand majority of Canadians, but this is a significant population with some very real concerns that the rest of us do not have to deal with. Now, we can look at how they're generating their energy. And for the most part, diesel electric generation. What you're seeing here is a tour I took of the Jackfish power plant in Yellowknife. And they're using multiple diesel electric generators. These are diesel engines taken out of locomotives that are now creating electricity. We've got our giant bulk storage tank here that I believe was about 3 million liters, and they're going through about 100,000 liters a day of diesel to keep the lights on. Now, Yellowknife is also served by the Snare River hydro system, and they do have about 28 megawatts of electrical generation through the hydro. But remember how I told you that they're at a 15-year low water period? They're not getting any hydro. They're saving those because they might need it in the winter to get through and get the extra energy. So they're holding off on that. And so what that means is we have multiple generators, but let's still call it a single point of failure. During the evacuation back a few years ago, just before, with the forest fires that kept closing the highway, they actually thought they were going to have to shut down their generators because they were waiting for a truck with all the lubricant for the engines, and it wasn't getting through. So this is a community of just shy of 20,000 people, not sure whether they were going to have power. Never mind the stress of wondering if they were going to have to get the hell out of Dodge because of the fires. And this is a pretty consistent story across the territory. What we see here is the energy profiles of 4 communities. I've got Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk. Both of these are north of the Arctic Circle. And then we've got Norman Wells and Hay River. These are all diesel electric microgrids. And Nuvik is the best one. It is the most efficient conversion of diesel energy into electricity at a whopping 37%. If you look at Tuck, their 27% of that chemical energy gets turned into electricity, with the rest being heat. I am a big proponent of heat pumps. I love them. I think they are an incredible tool for fighting climate change and electrification. They have no business in these communities. And I say that not from a technology perspective. We have great cold climate heat pumps. I spec them all the time. The reason is because of that conversion factor. Diesel is chemically pretty much the same thing as number 1 and number 2 heating oil. Even at a paltry 85% efficiency in a boiler or in a furnace, I'm a lot better off burning oil in the building than I am burning diesel to make electricity to heat the building electrically. If we electrify these buildings, we are moving further away from our decarbonization goals and further away from our economic goals. So they have a place in Ontario, clean, reliable energy throughout the whole province. Hell, put them up in Moosonee, put them up in Attawapiskat. That's not a problem. It's the diesel-electric microgrids that are a problem. On top of that, it's incredibly costly. What we see here is some pricing from Yellowknife, and they're about 30 cents per kilowatt hour on their electricity. Nunavut, going through Kulik Energy Corporation, they're at about 67 cents per kilowatt hour. So we have to think about the type of energy we're going to use. Recently on this project I was working on for these modular homes, my scope was plumbing, but because I had the experience in the Arctic and the other disciplines didn't, I helped everybody else to try to get a good product to these people. And we were having a conversation about preheating the HRVs. Do we do this with electricity, or do we do this with the complexity of hydronics? And I pushed for hydronics. I pushed hard. In fact, I teach hydronics at George Brown, so this was a fun exercise to do with my students. And we ran through it and we looked at the cost per BTU between the electricity and the oil. They could afford to run the oil. They wouldn't be able to afford to run the electricity. So we have to give consideration to the energy types here. I don't want to burn oil at 85%. That is antithetical to what I've built a career doing, but that is the reality. That is how we find ourselves in these situations. We must look not at what the best thing is, because trust me, as I found designing in the north, there's nothing that we've prepared for here. The materials we use aren't spec'd for this, aren't rated for these climates. The equipment isn't rated for it. We are looking exclusively at what is the least bad option. That is the position we're designing from, which is a weird place to be. Now, as I said, larger communities like Inuvik do have central utilities, but this can be incredibly expensive to install, service, and maintain. And the local geology and infrastructure can make infrastructure incredibly expensive. Now, I talked about the permafrost, but in Yellowknife, we're not concerned with permafrost. Yellowknife is all Precambrian bedrock similar to Muskoka. So you're not digging in Yellowknife, you're blasting in Yellowknife, which is also a very expensive proposition. Now, I also said earlier, we have to design for failure. That is the unfortunate reality. Despite our best laid plans, this will go wrong, and this will go wrong spectacularly. So how do we manage that? How can we address this or think about this? For that, I do want to take you to Yellowknife, and I'll show you that a little bit. As I said, this is Old Town Yellowknife, downtown by the water. This was built in the 30s. What happened was Yellowknife, somebody found gold, and then the place boomed. There was no plan for it. People just started showing up. Now, the buildings here do have the potable water tanks, as I said, and the sewage tanks, and the city provides this year-round as a service. What we see here, it might be hard to make out, but there's HDPE, or high-density polyethylene pipe, that's laid there. What the city does is in the summer, it's really quite clever, they lay this HDPE pipe on the ground and connect every house to it. So you're still on a tank, but your tank is now self-filling. And so you're somewhat connected to the public service at that point. You also have here, this license plate. And so this is a light to indicate when the tank needs to be filled, and the City of Yellowknife license plate is how the driver knows who to bill for that fill up. Because again, it is a public utility that they offer. Now, just up from Old Town, maybe 500 meters, is my friend's neighborhood. And you can see here, when I was there last November, she had yet another freeze up. That was the 5th burst water main that year that they've encountered. And the crew, kudos to the crew, minus 30, they were out there with steam wands correcting this, digging up the ground, because this was just all water. And you know what happens to water at minus 30? Oh yeah, the next day, everything here is absolutely iced in. Fences were heaving, cars were frozen in place. This is just a critical issue. And this is something that they get a lot of practice dealing with. Because again, it will fail. So anytime we design a potable water system, or really any other system, we have to think of a position of serviceability, maintainability, and restoration. It can't fail, but it will. So when it does, how do we recover? Okay? Now we also have, as I said, Inuvik, and this is also the utilidor. They do cross the roadway, so they had to lift it up. And despite their best efforts to communicate, you could see not everybody was quite clear on how tall that was or how their truck was, but it's holding up okay. Now, the utilidor has 950 connections, and there is 16 kilometers of above-ground utilidor and less than 1 kilometer buried. This was all put in the late 1950s, paid for by the federal government, and then the town of Inuvik took it over in June of 2000, following an agreement with the GNWT, Government of Northwest Territories. And so they're going through a replacement program now where they are replacing 500 meters, half a kilometer, of utilidor every year. And the cost to do half a kilometer of utilidor is $1.5 million. Okay? So 16 million, was that 24 million it's going to cost to replace this over a bit less than 14 years. So very, very expensive proposition. Inuvik's a very far away. It's hard getting crews up there. They don't even have a Tim Hortons. Actually, it's a really fun thing. They have the coffee in the store, but you fly out of Yellowknife or out of Calgary to go up there with the milk run with Canada North, and people are coming onto the plane with just big boxes of donuts, like they're smuggling drugs into the community, right? Because nobody can get it. And so it's, you're leaving Inuvik, can you hit up to Tim's? Can you bring me some donuts? So that's what we're talking about. It's a beautiful community. It's a great place. It's very small. It's just hard to get people there to work there and hard to get these projects done. Now, I do have this video here. You can look at this QR code when you get it, and you can watch a video me explaining to my students how the utilidor works and what it looks like. But what's interesting here, and what people might not appreciate, is all these solar panels here, all these PV, which a lot of people think is very odd. But remember, I told you, north of the Arctic Circle, we get periods of 24 hours of sunlight. In fact, in Yellowknife, you're getting 18 hours of sunlight in the summer. So it's a very short period to generate PV, but we get a whole lot of it in that short period. And in fact, in a lot of communities, like if you look at the community Grise Fjord up on Ellesmere Island, even in the summer, with literally weeks of 24 hours of sunshine, they still have a 5-degree outdoor design temperature. So we still have a heating load, we still have a domestic water load. PV is not really a bad idea in those communities. Obviously, it's not going to do 100% of our load, but it makes a big dent in our energy costs. So it's not as dumb as it initially sounds. And then we also have the community of Tuktoyaktuk. And this is a community, as I said, right on the Arctic Ocean. And what you're seeing here is the RCMP detachment housing. Very modern housing, built up on this Tridetic foundation. Tridetic's just a brand name, but it's become a shorthand. Just like nobody says, hand me that facial tissue, they say, hand me that Kleenex. Same idea. So very common. It's a successful Canadian company, I believe. And what you can see here is this green hose here is the water fill connection. Okay? That's how the potable water gets filled. They have the light here that's required by good practice, according to the Government of Northwest Territories and Nunavut. But the feedback is the float switch always freezes. So the light doesn't actually work. So how does the fill driver, the truck driver, know when the tank is full? Very, very simple. They fill it until the water comes out the overflow. You can't really see it here, but there's this big, massive icicle on the side of the building because the driver just keeps giving the coals to her until the water comes out. And so now we have this big freeze up on the side of the building. And that's something I tell designers as well. You've got that cold water freezing against the siding. What's it going to start doing? It's going to start splitting the siding and compromising your envelope. So we have to think about these things. We always have to assume not the worst of people, but assume that people are not going to use it the way we design it. Okay? I really don't want it to sound like I'm calling anybody in the North an idiot. I really don't want it to come across that way. But I'm very much reminded of that saying, if you make something idiot-proof, somebody will make a better idiot. And so we always have to give consideration to how other people are going to interact with our systems, because it may happen in very surprising ways that if we thought about this, we could have designed for it. So we really want to give consideration to that. Now, as I said, the honey truck is going to come and empty our sewage tank. And what we see here is the community of Tuktoyaktuk. Right on the Arctic Ocean, we've got a lake coming in here, our airstrip, and you'll notice this circle here. That's the reservoir. So what happens is they pump lake water into the reservoir for storage, and then it goes to the treatment plants, and at the treatment plant, they fill the truck and they drive it to the buildings. You use the water, you turn it into a different type of water, and now it goes into a different tank. The honey truck comes around and picks up your waste, and they drive it down here to the Tuktoyaktuk sewage lagoon, right here. This is another elegant solution as to how to dispose of our waste. We don't see waste treatment plants up there because we're not dealing with that many people making waste, and waste treatment plants are very expensive and complicated and require specialized training to operate. So instead, we dump our poop in the lake, and anaerobic and aerobic bacteria digest it. These things do have about a 25-year lifespan before they have to be decommissioned and a new one created. Now, has anybody here been to Yellowknife before? Okay, one hand in the back. Did you see the community or the lake, Niven Lake?
No, I was told to stay in the city limits.
Okay, so there's a community called Niven Lake, and this is Yellowknife's Forest Hill. This is where the high-to-dos live, and everybody wants to build with a beautiful view of this wonderful, pristine lake, which, don't get me wrong, looks really nice, has a nice little trail around, gorgeous. Until 1984, Niven Lake was Yellowknife's sewage lagoon. The hottest, most in-demand property in Yellowknife is the old shit pit. And so when I took a course in Alaska and I was asking about this, and they said they got a 25-year lifespan, I said, when you're planning communities, do you ever think about decommissioning these and then restoring it to some sort of, property, maybe a premium community? And the response I got was, what? No! Who would want to do that? And then I told him about Niven Lake and how it's the hottest place, and his mind was blown. So maybe there's a new opportunity there to reclaim these lakes and create high-end premium housing. What you also see here, which I have in the video, is called a pingo. And this is a really neat geological feature unique to permafrost environments. We start with a thawed area, typically a pond or a lake. And what happens is it thaws the permafrost, it melts, it refreezes, and when the water freezes, it expands. And you do this over and over and over geological timescales, and you start developing these really high blisters on the tundra that they've called pingus. It's the only place they exist, very, very neat to see, and a feature of Tuktoyaktuk, the land of the pingus. Now, the last thing I did want to touch on, which it's at the end of my presentation, but it is no less important than anything else. And this has to do with the communities, the cultures, and the customs. As I said, the North is a very vast landscape of peoples, cultures, and treaties. Now, Canadians don't often understand this or know this because we haven't been well educated about it, but the historical landscape or the colonial landscape of this country, we didn't just come in and have one treaty with one people. We expanded westward and northward. So there's a whole array of treaties all across the country with the First Nations in these lands. And in fact, I just realized this week is Treaty Week, so it's a kind of a timely discussion. Now, in the Northwest Territories, in Nunavut and Yukon, there are less treaties or fewer treaty lands than we have here, and more land claim areas. So Nunavut being a land claim where the government gave essentially deeded access or deeded title to the Inuit people in the Eastern Arctic in Nunavut. We have the same thing in the Northwest Territories. You can see here in 1984 was the Western Arctic claim with the Nunavut people. And so the government, as part of that settlement, gave these lands to the Nunavut people to administer on their own. Still Canadian territory, but they've been deeded the land. So if you want to put in a project, a resource extraction project, you want to explore for gas or oil or whatever, you're not necessarily going to the federal government for permission now. Now you have to go to the Nunavut people. And they're represented by a corporation they created called the Nunavut Regional Corporation. If you want a project done, they get a say because it's their land. And this is a really important, critical thing to understand because their priorities may be different from our own. Their lifestyle looks very, very different from our own. And so we have to respect their customs, especially since it can impact how we design buildings and our projects. So we do have different customs, we do have different languages, and we do have different legislative frameworks that we have to respect. We call it the Northwest Territories, but it is many different territories and many different agreements. So you have to understand how this is, who you have to talk to, depending on where your project is. Now, many Indigenous people, and especially Inuit people, are living a sustenance lifestyle. They're connected to the land in some capacity. A lot of this is traditional, and a lot of this is practical. I did show you the costs in the Northern Store. So they have to live off of the land in order to make ends meet, but they also do so because that is the custom and the lifestyle that has evolved in this area. So this can show itself in a few different ways. There can be hunting and fishing for country meats, again, to put food on the table. For the Western Arctic, caribou is a big one. Geese is a big one. There's also trapping fur for clothing or for sale to the south, as well as gathering of berries and medicines that do supplement their food. You have to know this because that's their priority. You want to build a project, you want to build a building, doesn't matter. You want to use local people to offset your labor. When the caribou start migrating or the geese start migrating, your project is no longer a priority because the community has to go hunt. They have to go hunt because there are elders, like Roger Grubin, who we met in Tuktoyaktuk, who can't hunt himself anymore. So people in the community come and bring him food. You're not just your immediate family that's relying on you in these communities, it's the whole community that's relying on you. So when those caribou start moving, everything stops. And what that means is, if you want to do another project, let's say resource extraction or exploration, they've got concerns about how it's going to impact the animals in this area. When they built the Inuvik-Tuk Highway, a big concern was that that is a migration route for the Barren Grounds caribou that they rely on. How is this highway, the construction of this highway, going to affect the migration of the caribou? Because for a generation plus, they're counting on them to be in a certain place at a certain time. If this all of a sudden throws off the whole migration route, that really messes with their hunting. Also, what about breeding grounds? Are we throwing off the caribou to the point that next year we're not going to have as many because we've stressed them out with this project? So that's a big concern. They want to know that whatever you want to do or whatever project they want to do, it cannot negatively affect their lifestyle in such a way. And this is something I really want to share with you because there's a dark, somewhat secret that people don't know about in these communities, which is the tragic tale of the messes we leave with these resource projects. Now, has anybody here heard of Giant Mine in Yellowknife? Right? Giant Mine was in the news now and for many years before, but it was a gold mine 5 kilometers north of Yellowknife. And it was operating between 1948 and 2004 and generating about 7 million troy ounce of gold. Now, the gold was locked in an arsenopyrite ore. And so this is gold with arsenic in there. And how they got the gold out was they roasted this ore. And what that did was release a toxic compound called arsenic trioxide. At the time they were roasting it, this just went up into the atmosphere, and it was heavier than air, so it settled on the ground in the water. And arsenic trioxide is heavier than water and heavier than air and water soluble. I'm sorry, soluble? That's the word I'm looking for. It was bad news. Yellowknife is the most contaminated place in Canada, full stop. There is enough arsenic trioxide there to kill every man, woman, and child in Canada 3 times over. That's what I've been told it put at. It is incredibly contaminated. Now, in the 1950s, the government saw this and said, that's not good. We need to do something about this. So they forced Giant Mine to put in scrubbers. So instead of letting the arsenic trioxide go out all throughout the air, they've captured it and they stored it in barrels. Now, what happened was when the mine closed in 2004, the mining company went bankrupt and they had no funds for remediation. And because of how contaminated this was, the government of Canada, that is all of us, had to step in and assume responsibility for the remediation of the site. There are 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide stored in metal drums that need to be disposed of. Now, unlike uranium or other radioactive elements, arsenic trioxide will never decay to become inert. Uranium, plutonium, whatever, eventually becomes lead. And the worst you have to worry about is lead poisoning. But arsenic trioxide will always be a problem. And the best plan we have for this now, store it underground and freeze it and hope it doesn't kill anybody. That's about where we're at. So if you think about a mine, you've got a vertical shaft, horizontal drifts. So what they've done was they've taken all this arsenic trioxide in these drums, they found an empty drift, they put it there, encased it with concrete, and they freeze it. Use thermosiphons so we can freeze it at no cost in the winter, mechanical cooling in the summer to keep it frozen, because we can't risk it getting into the water. And so we are all doing this to the tune of, currently between 2005 to 2038, we're looking at almost 4.4 billion for this remediation as a result. And this is not lost on the community. They did not consent to this, but yet they were still victims of it. And what you can see when you go around Yellowknife today is you'll see these air testing, air monitoring stations with English, French, and Dene as well to advise and communicate to the people what the purpose is. And so they're monitoring that air to make sure that there's been no release of arsenic trioxide. They're also testing the water. But they go beyond that, and they also show these maps as to where it's safe to harvest mushrooms and berries, because they are very much contaminated in a lot of places. If you drive around Giant Mine today, you'll see a lot of signs that say keep off contaminated, which I can read and you can read, but the moose can't read. The deer can't read. The birds can't read. So they're going through contaminated lands and then being hunted after the fact by community members. And in fact, there were signs warning people to keep out, but you can see these are English signs, and this was taken, I think, in the 1960s. Maybe English wasn't the best choice to use for the community at the time to really communicate this. And in fact, there was testing of hair samples for children in schools to look for arsenic levels in there. And that wasn't for nothing, because in the 1950s, a Dene child did die from harvesting berries. Harvesting berries or drinking water from the area, and died from arsenic poisoning. So it's a kind of a double-edged sword here. Indigenous people are not a monolith. I wouldn't presume to speak for all of them, and nobody would presume to speak to all of them. But one thing is consistent with everybody I talk to is they want the economic opportunity. They want the resource extraction. They want these things because these are good for the community. They don't want to bury their children because of it. That's the distinction. And that is what has happened. And that's a concern moving forward. We're in a renewed period of nation building because of the circumstances and the change with the politics with the US. We're looking inward, and we have a lot of resources that are incredibly in demand. And we're going to go after them because we need to. The unbroken truth of our civilization is if you didn't grow it in the ground, it came from below ground. That's really the only two ways we get things. So we need to do these mining projects. We need to get these resources. But we have to do it in a way that is respectful, ethical, and legal. So I want to show you this bit of legislation here. And this is called the United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, abbreviated or shortened to UNDRIP. Now, UNDRIP is a UN Declaration of Rights saying, hey, Indigenous people are human beings and worthy of the same rights and respect as anybody else. Which, you'd think would go without saying, except looking at our history and the history of the rest of the world that's been colonized, it absolutely has to be said. And so the Canadian government adopted this on June 21, 2021 as legislation in Canada, that Canadian government will support and enforce UNDRIP. The really important thing I want you to look to is FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. And that is a requirement under UNDRIP. It's not enough to consult with the First Nations and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this on your land. You cool with that? And if they say no, the government can say, well, at least we consulted. It's not good enough anymore. Now you have to have free, prior, and informed consent. They have to know what the project is going to be. They have to know what the impacts are, and they have to agree to it freely. That is the bar we're looking at. And so that is something that I encourage professionals to think about, because this has been a bit of a blind spot. As an engineering technologist, I have a code of ethics by my professional body, as do professional engineers also have a code of ethics. And basically, the most important part of it is we hold a duty of care to the public that interact with our designs. That is our highest priority, is their safety and their health beyond everything else. And so for professionals who are bound by a similar code of ethics, I ask you to look at this and evaluate this against your code of ethics. I don't think we have the luxury of just saying, well, maybe they're okay with it, maybe they're not. I think we have to do our due diligence and decide for ourselves if we're comfortable being involved with a project. Personally, I've been asking this question. I've been invited to look at a hazardous location building near Tuktoyaktuk for a gas turbine, part of the resource extraction. The first question I had was, is the community on board? Are they okay with this? The nice thing was that my client's client is the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, so yeah, they're on board, but we have to ask these questions. We have to make sure that there was the free, prior, and informed consent. The other thing is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which came out of the investigation into the residential schools and the harms that were caused by that. And out of that came 94 calls to action. And these are not 94, boy, it'd be really nice if you did. They're very much calls to action, which is a big part of why I want to do this, is the role that I can have in advancing the built environment for these communities, in being able to provide healthy, purpose-built, purpose-designed buildings for these occupants that are respectful not just of the climate and the geography, but their own cultural needs. You can imagine if you had a culture that evolved at the edge of the Arctic Ocean that first discovered there were other human beings on this planet in the 1920s or 30s, that culture did not evolve to live in housing the way yours or mine did. It's a very, very different culture. It's a very different view. And so I look at that as a great challenge, that I should be designing these buildings for them with that in mind, not looking at it and saying how I think a building should be and forcing them to accommodate. And with that, we'll close out. A couple things before we get to the comments and questions. If you would like to learn more about this topic, if you're going to work in the space or if you're just curious, we do have some links here to the courses I took at the University of Alaska. Fantastic courses, I highly recommend. Please feel free to connect with me and contact me, and I'd love to have a chat. And with that, if there's any questions, I'd love to hear them. Thank you. We got any questions, or? Oh, we got one back there. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind using the microphone, because I can't hear it worth anything.
Fair enough. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, you mentioned a lot about protecting the permafrost.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you take into account climate models going forward with climate change and the warming climate and how that affects how you plan for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. The Arctic is warming, and the Antarctic is warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. We know that heat moves from hot to cold, and so if you look at the natural currents of moving energy, we have trade winds and ocean currents that move heat from the equator up to the poles or down to the poles. And so they are warming at a much faster rate than we're experiencing down here. And the permafrost is an issue. You will see things called thermokarst. So karst would be this kind of, what would you call it, just an erosion of the soil. Now thermokarst is happening because the permafrost is melting and really washing away. This is a concern, this is an issue, and what we're seeing is big investment in communities like Tuktoyaktuk shoring up the shore of the ocean with concrete panels to reduce the erosion. Same with the rivers. That's what you can do at that level. With regards to the foundations of buildings, the only thing that I've seen we can do at this point is just what I suggested. We lift them up, and if that's not enough, you refreeze with a thermosiphon. It might get to the point that that's not enough, that our cooling or winter seasons are so short that we're not effectively refreezing that soil. Some places we might be there if we're talking about right next to the water, other places not so much. But it is something that is definitely on people's radar and something that they're looking at, concerned with. So I don't have a better answer, I'm sorry, but thank you for your question.
Where the water main broke, how long did it take them to rectify that and get cars frozen? Like how long was their procedure to handle something of that nature?
So my understanding, if I go back, there's a pretty big difference between the photos I took day and night, and that was one night's difference. There.
Sorry, Ness, can you repeat the question, because she didn't have the microphone at the time.
Oh, sorry. So the question was, with this freeze up, how long did it take for them to resolve the freeze up, thaw out the car, and all that? You can see a big difference from the night and the next day. They were able to get a lot of that drained. You can see here actually was the sewer drain. And so they're using pumps to bring all the water back to the drain. They'll have, City of Yellowknife is actually really good at this because it happens way too often. So they have a steam truck that comes in with a steam wand that they can use to thaw everything and get to it. So that part happens pretty quickly. The repair, I think, took a couple of days before they could do it. And that couple of days involves also having no water for long periods of time, right? As far as this car is concerned and unfreezing that, I don't have an answer for you. I will say this, fortunately, all of these houses are raised off of the ground. That's not a permafrost thing. What happens is where we are here, the bedrock comes down and drops pretty quickly, and so it's on a big gravel pad. And so they do have the water running underneath, and every year they're supposed to level these houses because of the shifting base. So the good news is nobody's floor got wet that I know of, but the bottom of the house definitely got encased in ice. Okay? And that, I think, was the 5th time she said that happened that year, so pretty common.
Is there any wind turbines in the
Wind
north?
turbines? Yeah. We're seeing more of these. These are starting to be more pilot projects. We're seeing them in some communities. I'm supposed to go up to Paulatuk in April, and they're looking at putting in wind turbines as a pilot. We'll see this at mines. The problem is not that they don't perform. It's a great spot for them. We got really good wind without any obstructions. The problem is the human capital it takes to erect them, maintain them, and ensure that they're functional takes a lot of skill that's not in the communities. So you have to bring this labor up. Maintenance is difficult and costly. The other thing is, being all diesel electric microgrids, handling transient sources is not something they can do well. For those who may not be aware, there's a whole lot of effort put in to match our generation electrically to our load. The second an electron is created, it needs to be consumed. It either needs to be used or stored. And so we can match our loads quite reliably with a generator, but with renewables, not so much, because you take advantage of them when you have the wind, when you have the sun, but you might not have the load. And so we're seeing more and more renewables, but a lot of communities are capped. When I took the tour of the Jackfish Lake power plant, my tour guide, Eileen, was actually the manager of it and a good friend of my friend's. And she was telling me they can't handle any more renewables. There were talks about the government supporting and providing rebates for solar panels on houses, because again, 18 hours of sunlight, that sounds great. Eileen said, absolutely not. We cannot handle any more transient generation. And the problem with these communities, how to put this, essentially they're in a purgatory. They are too big for the generation capacity that they have, not big enough to justify any further investment in it. And so they're always at this kind of edge. They've been experiencing brownouts and blackouts a lot, but to bring in more capacity or connect them to the North American grid would just be an insane cost. Now, when I say an insane cost, I'm not against it. We built this country by going after things with insane costs. So why stop at east to west? Why not carry on north? But that's the inertia. And the problem here is that there's not enough people in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, or the Yukon to afford this on their own, which means it's something that the whole country has to pay for. I'm personally in favor of that. That's how we built a country, but that means everybody gets a say, and a lot of people aren't saying yes. So they exist in this purgatory that does prevent them from really advancing those sorts of things. But the technology is getting cheaper. We're moving in the right direction, so maybe we'll see more. Thanks for your question.
Any other questions?
Anyone else? No? Awesome. Well, thank you very much, guys. Just put my contact info back up if anybody wants it. Somewhere here. There we go. Oh, crap. Overshot. There we go.
Will you hold that?
I sure can.
Okay, I'd like to thank Nis for that very enlightening presentation. I know now where I don't want to live. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Paul. It's been great.
Quick picture.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's been great.